Welcome, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you. And thank you so much for taking time from your busy schedule to join us this afternoon as we share new research on Native American and Indigenous Muslim stories, a project we call NAIMS. For those who are not familiar with ISPU, we are a nonprofit research and education organization. Our mission is to provide objective research and education about Americans who are Muslim to support well-informed dialogue and decision-making. This project is published in partnership with and made possible by generous support from the Doris Duke Foundation and support from IllumiNative. The mission of the Building Bridges program is to support national efforts working with U.S. Muslims to increase mutual understanding and well-being among diverse populations for the benefit of building stronger, inclusive communities. IllumiNative is a Native women-led racial and social justice organization dedicated to challenging the narrative about Native peoples. We invite you to please join the conversation today on this webinar using the chat and Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And you can continue the conversation on social media after the webinar and beyond, following us using these social media handles. The agenda for today's webinar includes, I'll share a little bit start with some information about the project, and then I'll hand it over to our primary investigator to share key findings from the research. And then we will be joined by panelists and hold a panel discussion, including our primary investigator, as well as two of our esteemed participants in the research. And then we will open it up for a Q&A session with our audience. A little bit before we sort of dive into the findings and the research itself, some background about the study. The NAIMS project is the first comprehensive study of its kind centered around spreading awareness of the lived experiences of Native American and Indigenous Muslims in the US, a group of which there is very little reliable information ascribed to it. The explicit intentions of the project were to raise awareness, to drive strategic philanthropy and allocation of resources, and to facilitate more accurate portrayals in media and education. ISPU brought together a diverse group of researchers, community members, story writers, photographers, and advisors in order to actualize these project goals. Last year, we published part of the project, the first part, which we called Visions and Voices, which includes beautiful portraits, narrative stories, and audio snippets from all of our participants. You can find these published on our website, and we can drop a link to that in the chat. Today, we are so honored and excited to have published the final portion of the project called Trends and Treasures, which is a report highlighting themes that emerged in the participant interviews, as well as the perspectives of Native Americans who are not Muslims. Joining us today to share the findings of this research is our primary investigator, Brennan McDaniel, and I'll invite Brennan to join us on screen and I'll just introduce him by reading his bio before I pass it on to him. Brennan is a PhD student in the at Yale University in the Department of American Studies. Drawing from Native American Studies, Islamic Studies, post-colonialism, and psychoanalysis, his research concentrates on the political economics of religion and secularism in the 21st century US. Take it away, Brennan.
Hi, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. It's so great to be here with you guys to share the research that we've done over the past couple of years. Like Aram mentioned, my name is Brennan McDaniel. I'm a PhD student here at Yale. I am the principal investigator on this project, and I'm excited to share the findings with you. Perhaps just a little bit about me and sort of what brought me to this work. Like several of our participants, actually, I kind of, moved away from home. And in my undergraduate career, I began sort of, exploring my Native ancestry more. My father's family is Melungeon. We're Saponi and Catawba descendants from East Tennessee in a tiny little community in Hancock County. And for my undergraduate work, I wanted to do sort of a community study on my father's side of the family, and in sort of exploring all of the kind of archival research and sort of Appalachian folk literature in our community, I came across all kinds of references to Muslims and certain kinds of religious practices in Appalachia in the Mountain South broadly that were kind of occluded in these kind of broader racial formations that took place after the Civil War through Jim Crow and throughout the 20th century. And so I actually became a Muslim the summer after I graduated college back in 2017. And so kind of I carried all of this into my graduate work, and just became curious about, what we might learn if we imagine Native American studies and Islamic studies as closely related fields, right, when they're often placed at a distance in the university. One of the questions I've always gotten is like, well, are there any Native Muslims, or, is the number so, important or relevant? And I think that this project, in addition to sort of being an awareness spreading project, certainly kind of debunk that idea, right? That Native American Muslims are here, we're present, we're sort of a very vibrant kind of community, both within the Muslim community and the broader American public. I admittedly am a bit of a rambler, so I'm going to try to keep some time here and get through the slides so we can still have a vibrant Q&A at the end. So the overall methodology of the project, as I said, we started this project a couple of years ago. It was in the winter of 2021. The NAIMS project consisted of two main parts. The first part is, the kind of bulk of the project were 17 semi-structured interviews with Native Muslims. And we sort of found our participants, including Zaid and Ashley here, through kind of, snowball sampling, right? It sort of began with my own sort of family and friends, and sort of, working through these kinds of personal networks to kind of find our participants. And the second part of the project included online focus groups with Native non-Muslims. We sort of anticipated that this would be a very important part of the project to sort of try and understand what broader Muslim American life takes place in and outside of Native communities, what the broader perception of Native Muslims were from their community members and family members who may not be Muslims themselves. And all of this took place through the kinds of collaborations that Era mentioned before with photographers, storytellers, and we worked to produce these vignettes and a reproducible photo narrative exhibit, which you can find on the ISPU website. There were a bit of difficulties with participant recruitment on both sides, which I feel are important to sort of talk about, both in this project, but also since NAIMS is hopefully going to spur more research in this area, right? A large number of participants, to put it shortly, we're not Indigenous, right? That we learned that the word Indigenous sort of circulates differently in Muslim communities, often referring to any sort of Muslim from the US, or that the sort of definition of Indigenous was sort of taken very capaciously, right? Kind of this assumption that we're all Indigenous to somewhere. And this sort of worked as one of many mechanisms to kind of render the Native American Muslim community sort of illegible or sort of under the radar. And also several of the participants, this was an online project sort of going on through the pandemic, right? Several participants, wanted to participate but could not, or, because our channels were largely online, that they became unreachable, so on and so forth. So all of these are, great things I think to consider in further research going forward. And so the advisors that we brought on board were Dr. Kyle Mays, who's a professor in the Department of African American Studies and American Indian Studies and History at UCLA. And we brought in Dr. Jennifer Graber, who is the Shiv, Lindsay, and Gray Professor in the History of Christianity, as well as the Assistant Director of the Native American Indigenous Studies Program at UT Austin. And we also were assisted heavily by Leah Salgado, who is the Chief Impact Officer at IllumiNative. And several other members of IllumiNative also joined in and helped when they could. We were very thankful to have not only the support of Crystal Echohawk and the administrative people at IllumiNative, but several voices jumped in, and they sort of offered the full sort of support of the organization in making this project possible. So now I'll be happy to sort of go through the project one part after the other. So here's the first part, right? The findings through our 17 interviews with Native American Muslims. So as I mentioned, 17 of these interviews were conducted. Participants in the project were citizens or lineal descendants of federally recognized, state recognized, or non-federally recognized tribal nations in the United States. At least one of our participants came from an indigenous community outside of the borders of the continental United States, but we considered their experiences to be one of, Native American, US-based Muslim communities insofar as they lived here, sort of trying to acknowledge the kind of, movements and intimacies that Native peoples engaged in prior to colonialism and the kind of formal establishment of borders in North America or broader Turtle Island. And we had 4 distinct themes emerge in this research that I'll go through one by one. Thanks, Aram, also for engaging the slides here. So the first theme that emerged was around Muslim and Native identity. Our participants frequently discussed sort of very deep complexities around being both Muslim and Native American. For example, sort of consistent with research on convert communities in the US, many of our participants sort of were drawn to Islam by living in areas with higher historically higher rates of Muslims living in these communities. So this was through having friends or distant family members or by marrying Muslims. And in addition, sort of, being in the broader age of technology also facilitated some of our participants in converting to Islam. Although not all of our participants, as we'll see, were converts, the majority were. And despite Islam and indigeneity sort of being constructed normally as sort of having a large distance between them, our participants, perhaps not so surprisingly, did not imagine their identities to be as fractured or as mutually exclusive as perhaps certain publics may think. And we learned from them that they blended their Native identities and with being Muslim in very unique ways that were tailored to their own lived experiences, and that they were able to sort of draw from both in order to make decisions on a daily basis. Some found, that there were some minor limitations, right? That they felt that perhaps engagement in Muslim communities often required them to leave behind certain parts of their culture. So, that their traditional foods may be less welcome at an iftar, or that, the broader perceptions of Muslims about indigenous religion or about Native communities were sort of less understood, and that would lead to a kind of selective choosing beyond their own sort of individual desires when participating in the broader Muslim community. If we can go to the next slide. Here's a quote from Latanya Barlow, who was one of our participants. She's Diné Chiricahua Apache. And I'll just give a few seconds to read that quote. Great. So the second theme that emerged in this research was one of similarities between Native cultures and Islam. There was a huge bulk of the discussion which focused on harmony between Native cultures and Islam. Overwhelmingly, our participants sort of found that Islam and their Native cultures were not only compatible, but actually shared some deep similarities. This would include both spiritual practices, but also guiding philosophies. For example, both Islam and Native and their sort of traditional cultures emphasizing a long-term sort of stewardship with the land, a respect and intentionality with humans and non-humans, the sort of broader natural world, an emphasis on family and so forth. are these similarities, if we go into the next slide as well, these similarities also kind of extended to the nature of sort of sharing marginalized identities, right? Of sort of being a small community within a small community. Our project or ISPU estimates that Native Muslims make up 1% of the broader Muslim community, which itself makes up 1% of the broader American population. And while there were a lot of similarities, some participants also reported some tensions, right? That they felt that parts of their culture were sort of, incompatible with Islam. But of course, that these kinds of the similarities and the differences depended heavily on where they came from, both their tribal nations' longstanding beliefs, but also the school of thought, or even down to the mosque that they attended. And nevertheless, that the kind of combination of their identities still meant that they could draw from both native culture and Islam, although this sort of, the degree at which they drew from either or sort of differed. But this sort of reflects a broader kind of understanding that the Native American community is certainly not monolithic, that even the term Native American itself suggests a collective that never really existed, right? That each tribal nation has its own beliefs, its own language, its own governing bodies, and so forth. If we can go to the next slide. And yeah, well, the third sort of theme that emerged, which is particularly important as we gather here today, was on Palestinian and Native American solidarity. Several of the participants at least described in detail, or at least mentioned, solidarity between Palestinians and Native peoples as one of the potential or potentially one of the most immediate or urgent places that community engagement might take place, and sort of as an inspiration for their activism, or as even a full inspiration for their conversion to Islam to begin with. In particular, our participants cited the No Dapple struggle at Standing Rock as a place that drew together both an unprecedented number of tribal nations, but also American Muslim activists. And several of our interview participants were engaged directly or indirectly with this struggle. And according to our participants, the struggle not only put Native-led ecological movements on the radar of Muslim Americans, but also movements for ongoing movements rather for tribal sovereignty, whether this was movements for state and federal acknowledgement that certain tribes are engaged in, or an acknowledgement of the United States government's failure to oblige treaty obligations that established Native nations to begin with. One of our participants mentions in the chat here, water rights, right? That these were very sort of issues that were then put on the radar for many American Muslims, particularly younger American Muslims. If we could go to the next slide. And one of the quotes here from Dr. Miriam Black Eagle sort of puts it best, that that there is such a mutual relationship between Palestine and Native Americans, that these broader comparisons can help us understand what the structures of settler colonialism look like, right? Both in terms of how land theft, genocide, ethnic cleansing, the taking of culture, the destruction of language, and even our broader sort of ecological crises are linked, not only in how they are executed, but in how they are resisted. And hopefully we can continue this particular part of the conversation at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. And the fourth theme that we looked at, and what really emerged in this project, is the hopes and needs of Native Muslims, right? That one of the things that was important for me and for the whole team was that this wouldn't just simply be a story of struggle, of hardship, right? But also one of joy, of pleasure, of overcoming, and of a sort of optimistic outlook for the future. Unanimously, all of our participants kind of expressed a need or a desire for the broader Muslim community to sort of acknowledge their existence, right? Both as individuals representing their tribal nations, but also the kind of broader Native community as sort of being part and parcel of the American Muslim community at large. If we can go to the next slide. And so these quotes from two of our participants just sort of underscore the kind of need for allyship and solidarity between Muslims and tribal nations, and the kind of deep potential that this has in sort of engaging kinds of the contemporary structures that are allowing for global suffering to take place. And I'll quickly move on to the themes of our focus groups. Which is the second part of the project. So we did, the team engaged in sort of 3 focus groups totaling 17 participants again. All of our participants were citizens of federally recognized tribal nations, and they were not Muslim. If we go to the next slide, and 4 themes emerge here as well. All of our participants in the focus groups, they came from a variety of religious backgrounds, right? Although Christianity has a deep history in Native communities, one that is often violent, it is the sort of majority religion represented in Native communities that sort of rests outside of their traditional beliefs. The first theme that we have was the kind of broader idea of encountering Native American Muslims. All of our participants were asked, had they encountered Native Muslims before, and the overwhelming answer was no, at least within their tribal community. But 2 did report having at least one Native Muslim friend, and this was a close contact, somebody that they knew intimately, and was a source of learning about Islam for them. And related to this is the sort of the second theme, which is understanding Islam, and that we learned that focus group participants generally shared a broad sort of awareness of Islam as a world religion, right? They did sort of mention that their first encounters with Islam as a religion and Muslims as people sort of came from harmful media stereotypes, but the majority of them, if not all of them, did put great effort into kind of dispelling these myths and to sort of doing their own research. We may go as far as saying that the participants had a much broader understanding of Islam and Muslims than we could see in the broader American public today. If we go to the next slide. So this is sort of, quotes from our participants. We kept these participants in the focus group anonymous, and these focus groups did turn very conversational, and a lot of information was shared that we are keeping sort of behind the scenes, just in the spirit of confidentiality and of sort of allowing tribal nations to decide what sort of knowledge they render public and what they keep private. The third theme that we encountered was sort of a reiteration of sort of perceived commonalities and differences between Native cultures and Islam. A lot of these included, fasting, prayer, sort of a belief in monotheism. And again, it's sort of impossible to comprehend the kind of differences and similarities between Islam and Native peoples just because of the sheer diversity of Native nations that exist in what is now the United States and beyond. What came up in the interview what came up in the focus groups was sort of another or a further idea that Native peoples and Muslims are both sort of dealing with enduring media stereotypes and existing as heavily marginalized minoritized groups in the United States. Lastly, our focus group participants very much emphasized Islamophobia as being a very pervasive problem. This was the first research of its kind to sort of ask what might Islamophobia look like on an Indian reservation, and sort of what the Native American community broadly perceives, or how rather the Native American community broadly perceives Islamophobia as operating within the general American public. And all of our participants sort of thought that Islamophobia was getting worse on various levels of society, actually, that its effects sort of permeated both interpersonally and also institutionally. If we could go to the next slide. And so several rich quotes coming from this discussion as well. And if we could go to the next slide, the research did lead to a number of recommendations that ISPU has, and I'll just run through these very quickly. The first recommendation being that additional research is certainly needed in this area, right? This is very much a pilot study. Our sample size was limited to 17 participants on both parts of the project. A common sort of request was to create community gatherings to bring Muslims and Native peoples together, and perhaps using the struggle at Standing Rock as a launching point for sort of cross-community engagement. Another point was that Muslims should intentionally engage and learn about Native peoples. So, a common theme would be for their mosque to learn whose tribal nation, whose tribe's land that their mosque is built on, rather. Another point was emphasizing that creative programs can help build this particular understanding, right? That this kind of work should both take place in the form of research, but also in arts and performance, literature, and so forth. And ultimately, the project is suggesting that education is key for everyone, right? That everyone could stand to gain by learning more about Muslims and Islam as a diverse religion, and particularly as the American Muslim community is perhaps the most diverse or among the most diverse Muslim communities in the world. And of course, which is to say that Native Muslims are part and parcel of this sort of very diverse community of Muslims. And that'll be it for me for now. And hopefully we can now move on to the question and answer part of the webinar. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Brennan. It was great to hear from you about your personal investment in the project, as well as the the findings itself. I'd like to now invite you, Brennan, to join us on camera, and as our panelists are comfortable, and I'll be introducing our panelists. We have with us today Brennan, who you all met, and then we have Ashley Wolford and Zaid Wharton Ali, who are both participants in our project. So I'll just begin by introducing them. Ashley Wolford is a Choctaw Native American based in Chicago and has been involved in the arts and community organizing spaces. Zaid Wharton Ali is Mescalero Apache in Poughkeepsie, New York, who grew up balancing both his Muslim and Native identities. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for this conversation. And before we open it up to sort of an audience Q&A, I'd like to just start with a moderated conversation. So Zaid, let's start with you. As Brennan mentioned, there's sort of a broad finding was that most of the participants in this study were converts, but not all are. Can you share your story and your reaction to the assumption that all Native American Muslims are converts, especially that given that similarities and understanding of Islam emerged as a theme in this report?
For sure. Thanks for the question. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you for coming. So my story, my background, just a little bit. I'm from LA, grew up in LA. Both of my parents are mixed. My dad is Muslim, but my mom was a convert, and she also participated in the project as well. So I think a really big issue that Indigenous communities deal with in general is erasure, and the erasure of our histories and our participation in the economy and things like that. And so I think part of that is the misunderstanding of how wide Indigenous cultures and identities have spread across the continent and how they've mixed with other races and cultures and things of that nature. So I think I'm an example of kind of how far-reaching and how seemingly disparate communities can come together underneath an Indigenous and Islamic identity. And so I think what gets missed is the amount of generations of kids and people in general who are Indigenous, who have grown up in the United States with different experiences and from different mixed backgrounds and things like that. So I think that's the biggest thing of why people think most Indigenous people are converts, but they fail to recognize the kind of development of Indigenous identities in general in the United States.
Thank you so much for sharing that, very personal perspective from your experience. Ashley, we'd love to hear from you. In your story, you talk about not being raised with a strong Native background and the challenges that created for you. Can you speak on what that meant for your identity and how you find connections now to your roots? Also, what message would you have for American Muslims as they start the conversation around foster care?
Hi, I'm Ashley, and I'm representing Shine Nations Youth Council and the First Nations Garden. So I speak on their behalf with their permission today. Yes, I basically grew up without any sense of community within the Native population. And it wasn't until I became, I guess, in my early 20s, I independently traveled to South Dakota where I was able to attend sweat lodges. And unfortunately, this elder has since passed on. So therefore, I no longer travel to South Dakota. But as of recently, the Shine Nations community has built a sweat lodge in the First Nations garden. So for me personally, this is a symbol of resilience. It's a symbol of resistance because we are able to, in the city of Chicago, have this ceremony to conduct in an urban setting, which is almost completely unheard of. And without access to the First Nations garden, I would not be able to attend a sweat lodge ceremony, and I wouldn't be able to have this access to practicing my spiritual and cultural identity if we did not have this here in the First Nations garden in Chicago. In terms of the foster care system, I actually grew up with majority of my family with distant relatives. So therefore, I had a different experience than the majority of Native people that grow up in foster care, where that's a system of erasure. And it's a tool for cultural genocide, essentially. And usually, most Native people that are in the foster care system are usually placed in homes with majority white Caucasian people, and it's usually a tool to sort of erase the Native identity from Indigenous people. So I had a lot more of a different experience than most people that were in the foster care system. And I just sort of implore the Muslim community to go into their cities and just do a lot more research and make a connection with Native people, because obviously erasure has been very prevalent within American mainstream colonial society. So just look in your community in urban areas and there's, I'm sure a huge population that no one actually really knows about in terms of the Native community. So I just want to speak on the behalf of Shine Nations Youth Council and First Nations Garden. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ashley. And I think what you spoke about in sort of your closing comment there really speaks to the recommendation Brennan shared around education being absolutely key for everybody. Brennan, I'll now turn to you. I had the pleasure of working with you throughout, well, through portions of the project. And I still remember the very beginning and all the excitement around the project and just the fact that this project existed. And I would love for you to speak to that, of why this study on Native American Muslims is so significant, and what would you like to see happen next?
Thanks so much, Aram. Yeah, it is still wild for me to believe that that was several years ago now. You know, time has in some ways has been really short, but has also gone by really quickly. What's the phrase that the days are short, but the months are long, you know? So it's been great to finally get to this point. Yeah, so I think the project actually ended up performing a number of things that we had not anticipated, right? Like I think we sort of approached the project modestly as sort of a way to just sort of, you know, spread awareness of Native Muslims as a, you know, that this was sort of the first project of its kind. So there was so much room to begin engaging, and I don't think we imagined the impact to be as actually as great as it ended up being. That you know, one of the best things about it is that we garnered a lot more attention than we thought, that we sort of got, you know, a huge number of participants. You know, we have a really vibrant audience here today, but also the kind, like the sheer amount of people that have written into us, both who are Native Muslims and not, you know, expressing interest for the project, you know, has been amazing. You know, even with our panelists here, Zaid and Ashley, I've gotten to be friends with them, right, over time. You know, I had actually heard of Ashley or seen a video of Ashley actually when I first became a Muslim in 2017. So, you know, I've sort of got to meet people myself. Basically what I'm trying to say too is that like the project has sort of served as a way to bring Native Muslims together. You know, I think, you know, we've had more than one event where, you know, our participants have gotten to know each other. I think one of the things we're hoping to do going forward is to sort of establish a network to keep all of our participants in touch. And I think that this could look like a number of things. One of the other big things that I'm hoping will happen is sort of you know, being able to present the photo narrative project in mosques around the U.S. That the project sort of catches on within the Native arts world. You know, I do know that we have an exhibit that we're hoping to pass around and that mosques can actually get involved in. I think this was actually mentioned in our chat here. You know, both distributing this webinar and continuing to publish materials that the project yields, I think is a really great thing to go to that'll be happening going forward. And I think, you know, it would be great too that this project ultimately spawns more research in this area. If we could sort of, you know, if it functions to direct funds both towards other research on Native Muslims, or just as a way to direct funds into Native communities, both the urban communities that, for example, the one that Ashley is representing here today, and both, you know, reservation communities and so forth. And if all of the recommendations that ISPU sort of put out for education and community engagement take place, and it sounds like to me that the majority of them are actually underway, then I think that the project would just be a monumental success, more of a success than it already has been.
Thank you so much, Brennan. I'd like to now pose a question to any of our panelists, and you're welcome, whoever would like to answer. We'd love to hear from any of you who would like to comment on this. As Brennan shared, solidarity with Palestinians came up as a theme or in the interviews. I'd love to just have whoever would like to talk more about that in terms of your own personal experience.
Yeah, I can jump in. So I think this is something that an issue I've talked about for a long time. But I think something also important to mention is that both of my parents were, this is an issue obviously that both of my parents were active in struggling against within the United States and showing their support for Palestinian movement in general. But I think it's obviously the general issue itself isn't, you know, quote unquote complicated, but I think it's very similar to American conquest and the experience of Indigenous peoples in North America, just because it's an Indigenous population and someone else trying to force themselves into a country. But I think the bigger thing is that I think a big issue with the Palestinian and Israel conflict is the identification of countries based on their religious beliefs. I think it's kind of reductive to quantify or identify countries in the Middle East as like Muslim countries, because I feel like that takes away from individual nations, cultures, and ethnicities, and all kinds of things like that. For example, like Indonesia is the biggest or most populous Muslim country in the planet, but it looks a lot different than what Saudi Arabia would look like. So I think because of that identification of like Muslim countries in the Middle East, I think it takes away from the multiplicity of cultures and identities of Indigenous Palestinian people, because originally it was a melting pot of people from all kinds of different backgrounds, similar to what I spoke about in my experience of being born Muslim and Indigenous. It kind of is reductive to the understanding of the differences between cultures and ethnicities and religions within a given, border that is constructed by, the UN or other countries. So that's just my piece.
Thank you so much for sharing. Brennan or Ashley, anything else to add or another perspective or?
Yes, I would like to comment on the Palestinian activism within Chicago's community. I would say that here in an urban setting, we're very active in solidarity with our Palestinian relatives. However, on social media, when you sort of engage with natives in a more rural setting outside of the city of Chicago, you can see there's like a very high rate of Islamophobia and a very colonial mindset. I'm not really sure this is based on their like constant engagement with media, such as like Fox News being their only source of media engagement, but there's a very high level of just Islamophobia and very anti-Palestinian rhetoric. And I think a lot of that is because their primary source would be just the white colonial mindset of those they're engaged with, because they live in a very like rural setting or a very country setting. So unfortunately, I've seen like a very anti-Palestinian rhetoric on social media, which is like extremely disheartening because we have so many similarities in terms of brutality, loss of language, loss of culture, genocide. And for me, it's like very disheartening to see that type of rhetoric amongst the Native American community in the broader country outside of Chicago. Here in Chicago, we're a very activist city, like 20,000 people organized to protest for Palestine. The Chicago community here is just very active, but unfortunately, the wider Native American community seems to have a very colonized mindset because, in my opinion, I think it's Christianity that is the main religion they practice and have been colonized in their minds. therefore I feel like almost saddened by having this type of engagement, because they really just don't want to hear the side of a pro-Palestinian opinion, unfortunately. And to me, it's just so disheartening, because I personally have such a passion for Palestinian activism, in my opinion. So thank you for allowing me to express myself here.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for sharing that. And I think maybe what your comment also may get at another point Brennan was making around, proximity to densely populated, Muslim areas, and that may be in line with contact theory, things like that. So lots to sort of dig in there. Brennan, do you have anything to add before we move on to audience questions?
Yeah, I appreciate both Zaid and Ashley's answers. One of the best quotes that I think we got on this subject, which was in the PowerPoint, was actually from Ashley, kind of talking about this, right? That the kind of importance of Native American and Palestinian activisms independently and together lines itself up not just with sort of contemporary knowledge production, but with sort of longstanding knowledge that elders have, right, about the importance of, all kinds of people sort of coming together to sort of work through global crises. And yeah, I think that this, the particular violence that's taking place today in Palestine, I think that this was just an issue that has been on most Native people's radar. It's been an issue that has been discussed in my family growing up. And it is interesting that even within the Native community that there is some polarization, right? That there is actually, I mean, there's deep sort of engagement, thorough activism, right? Sort of learning, comparing settler colonialisms in both places, that in fact we can see that the tactics are shared, and that, that it is ultimately about the elimination of Native peoples. And that, that the word indigenous itself can come to be a place of organizing, right? That indigenous peoples, including Palestinians, are stewards of the majority of, the remaining biodiversity on Earth, right? So, and to think about this as being, part of the broader struggle for indigenous sovereignty, for against the climate crisis. We understand that militaries are some of the largest polluters on Earth as well, right? And that there's, I think that the conversation about Native American and Palestinian solidarity comes to touch and comes to rest on pretty much every global conflict that we can imagine right now. That it comes to symbolize, I think the majority of the sort of the deepest pressing problems that will be of the 21st century. So I think that the question sort of has a lot more to, it gestures towards, a long history of knowledge and of solidarity and of, a necessity around, mutual engagement. But it's also one that its importance will continue to show itself, in time perpetuity, or, in perpetuity from now.
Thank you so much, Brennan and Zaid and Ashley, for sharing your perspectives. I'd love to open it up now to audience questions, which I will field. I'll kind of throw them out there and see who would like to respond. The first is we're going to shift our focus through this question to more familial issues. So the question is, how do these two communities understand marriage and negotiate practices? What is the divorce rate in the community, and how is it handled cross-culturally? I don't know if any of you guys would like to speak to that question. or Brennan, if you have any prior research on that, on any of those topics.
I think that's a very, very interesting question. It's not one that I'm particularly well versed on, to be honest. You know, I can say that at least with our participants, that sort of came from you know, sort of in our among our participants who converted to Islam, who cited that their first major exposure to Islam was of their partner, that, or you know, that their eventual spouse. I believe the majority, or if not all of them, said that they had converted prior to meeting the spouse. And so I know that there's been sort of a long debate within Muslim communities about sort of, you know, married converts, and sort of, you know, is there sort of a validity, say, in converts who convert for marriage, right? And this kind of debate. But I don't think that this was necessarily opened up by our participants.
Thank you. And I think actually that would make, it's good for us to kind of file that in the back of our mind as an area perhaps for future research. Another question, how does being Native American feel in relation to other Muslims? And I think, you know, some of what you shared, Brennan, kind of speaks to that, but maybe if Ashley or Zaid would like to sort of speak to their experience, if you know, if you're comfortable doing so.
I actually think it's kind of an isolating feeling because there's just a lot of stereotypes about Indigenous people, for example, that we're not really like a monotheist group of people, and we worship like a sun god, or other just like stereotypes that we get like free college tuition, we don't pay taxes, and I think amongst like a group of people within a very high financial background within like the Muslim community, it could be sort of an isolating feeling because you almost kind of feel like discriminated against in a way, because I think the Muslim community is extremely well off for the most part. So it's almost kind of as if they're kind of looking down upon you in a way because you've sort of been stripped of any type of resources in, you know, rural Native communities, and you're basically coming from nothing, which is, you know, an attempt to genocide and eradication. So I feel like it's kind of disheartening and almost kind of like, oh, so what do you do here when you sort of invite the Muslim community to spaces like the First Nations Garden here in Chicago? So I do kind of feel disheartened, as if, for example, our cultural and spiritual identities aren't valued as much, I think. In my opinion.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. Zaid, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, thanks for sharing your experience, Ashley. I think I think in my own personal experience, because I'm so mixed, I'm able to like pass in a lot of like Muslim spaces. But I think generally this is why things like tribal specificity and understanding of cultural backgrounds within Islam are important, because depending on someone's cultural background, you know, that can imply a lot of understanding about Indigenous issues depending on where they're from, or where they grew up, or if they went to college and studied, things like that. So a lot of Muslim people I come across are depending on their backgrounds, are either very understanding and generally welcoming, or have a very extreme lack of understanding of Indigenous communities in general, which ends up leading to stereotypes and things that kind of Ashley touched on. And I think that's kind of generally the biggest issue is just the lack of understanding, lack of representation in popular culture, a lack of representation in schools and studies. And it's not even so much for me that it's a lack of representation on a base level, because you do get that, oh yeah, Christopher Columbus came in 1492 and natives were here and blah 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 blah, but you don't get the underlying stories of resistance and how indigenous communities, interacted with settlers. And you just kind of get this broad story of, okay, yeah, American or like British people came in and conquered, and over time native people died, but you don't get the underlying specific stories that I think add a lot to people's understandings of why things are the way they are now. And I think one example of that is Killers of the Flower Moon that just came out, Scorsese and Leonardo DiCaprio. And I think, again, it's like that level of representation where you go to the movie. And I've studied about the Osage tribe, and I've written about it in my like economic writing and things like that. So I came in with already a high level of understanding of the story of the tribe. And a lot of these things and these instances and representation gets passed off in a way because it's like, oh, well, I didn't know about this story beforehand, but now I know. But there's like a lot of damage that gets done in the portrayal of characters and in like which stories they choose to portray within the general story of the tribe, how violence is portrayed within movies and things like that. So I think there's a lot of these like more subliminal issues that we haven't necessarily gotten to yet because of the overall lack of understanding of Indigenous culture in general. So I think that is the constant battle that we're having to fight, and it takes place, unfortunately, within Muslim communities as well.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And again, that just touches on the theme that Brennan shared around a desire for American Muslims to learn more about Indigenous cultures. Brennan, I'm going to pose the next question to you. I have been teaching Native American history in an Islamic school. The curriculum has been updated and is great, but I need to infuse all of this information into the standards and the lessons as much as possible. How can I gather materials that can be used across the grade levels for Islamic school? I'm really excited to be able to add material to the school, which is beyond my own personal information. I associate with Nanticoke and Lenni Lenape.
Yeah, I think this is such a cool question. I think that the fact that this person is, endeavored to teach, Native history in an Islamic school to a community of entirely Muslims is, just exceptional, actually. I do think I can sort of tie this into the past question that we had that Ashley and Zaid answered, as well as sort of, what somebody had mentioned in the chat a little while ago, which is that, part of the misunderstanding of Native peoples, comes from both sort of representations about Native cultures, about, pre-colonial practices, about the story of American nationhood to begin with, but also a contemporary sort of misunderstanding that Native peoples are not simply a minority group within the United States, right? That it's not simply just one community, a single racial minority, right? That Native peoples have been rendered a racial minority, right, as part of racializing them and folding them in to the broader United States body politic, but Native peoples are in fact members of pre-existing nations, right? That Native peoples have inherent sovereignty. This is both sovereignty recognized by the United States government as independent nations that were established through treaty agreements, but also that tribes acknowledge each other's sovereignty, right? That it's not solely just the United States establishing who is and who is not Native, but tribes will acknowledge others, right? There are kinship forms of sovereignty, right, adoptions and so forth. There are tribes that acknowledge tribes that are not federally recognized, or the majority of tribes in the Southeast lack such federal acknowledgement, but still recognize each other. And so we do have to understand Native peoples as containing inherent sovereignty, but also sort of acknowledge that sovereignty does extend beyond what the United States government defines as sovereignty. But sort of, so, I would say that, where this person might turn to materials that could be used across grade levels, I think, I do know that there is a burgeoning world of, Native literature, specifically for kids, children's books. I do think that, there may be efforts to sort of, update educational materials. I'm not fully familiar on what these would be, but I do think, perhaps the ISPU project is a place to start, right? That the photo narrative project does include vignettes. It is sort of presentable to, a variety of different audiences. I think that this person's question could also suggest that one thing that the NAIMS project could do is actually come up with curriculum guides, or sort of, at least be consulted in the development of curriculum guides, particularly as we share the project going forward. So I appreciate this question, both as a question that prompts us to think about Native cultures and of sovereignty and of United States history, but also as a reminder that perhaps the project, could do a whole lot of good in the realm of curriculum development going forward.
Yeah, Deborah, and I hope we'll make an effort to reach out to you and see where we can coordinate and work on this together. Okay. And then another question for you, Brennan, that kind of gets to a question around the study and the methodology. How many total respondents, which ultimately met the criteria, were there? And do we have an estimate of the percent or size of this population in the US?
Oh, that's also a good question. We continue to get responses to participate long after the interviews were conducted, actually. I would say that the number of responses that we got of people participating far doubled, I think, the amount that we were able to interview, right? We kept the number, it was both a number that we kept because of the time constraints on the project, but also just so we were able to give every participant sort of an ethical honorarium for participating, right? That we didn't want to, valuing time and valuing the energy that went into this, we could only, to keep the honorariums high is sort of what we did, right? And I do think that we were also surprised by the amount of participation, that the number of people writing in and wanting to be interviewed. In terms of the sort of estimated percentage of this Native Muslims in the US, right? That if we imagine Native peoples broadly as perhaps constituting anywhere from 1 to 2, perhaps a little over 2% of the United States population, of Muslims kind of constituting around 1% of the US population. I think according to ISPU polls, it says that Native Muslims constitute 1% of the Muslim population. So numerically, I'm not very good at math, but I think that could be sort of a way to understand. Although census information is perhaps a little inadequate for a number of reasons. There are always problems in polling, and I think the same issues we had in participant recruitment might actually show up in how Native peoples are reported demographically, that it is sort of based on self-identification alone rather than participation within a Native community or any other sort of measures that Native peoples might be using to determine who does and does not count. And also the fact that there are millions of Indigenous people, or hundreds of thousands, if upwards of, a larger of, Latinos in the United States who are Indigenous or have Indigenous ancestry that are not captured by, the US's legal process for acknowledging Native tribes. But yeah, I think that this is also pointing to kind of, further research in disciplines like statistics or demography to sort of, pay attention to this study.
For Ashley and Zaid, there's a question: how do the panelists typically connect? And also Brennan, feel free to chime in. How do you typically connect with fellow Native American and Indigenous Muslims? Is it by word of mouth, events?
I personally only know of a group of sisters, which I previously have like mentioned in other conversations, which are 3G or Maimuna Yusuf, who is also Choctaw, African American, and Muslim. So personally, I feel that that has been my only connection to other known Muslims with the same tribal affiliation. Other than that, I don't really have a relationship with very many Muslims that are also Indigenous as well.
Yeah, I'd echo the same sentiment. I think it's hard. I think it's been hard for me growing up in a city in general to connect with other Indigenous people, period, outside of my family and people we know and communities that we kind of participate in frequently. And then also within that, it gets even harder to connect with other Indigenous Muslim people. Typically for me, it's been word of mouth. And I think especially just folding back on my point of erasure, I think a lot of Black Americans are understanding their Indigenous and histories as well and ties to Indigenous communities. And so I think it's a lot of times, like Brennan also pointed out with Latino and Latinx people in America, like a lot of a lot of connections to indigeneity are hidden. And oftentimes it's hard to even recognize. So I think now it's because of projects like this and because of shifts in the understanding of Indigenous identities in general across America, people are starting to understand themselves and indigeneity in new ways and their connections to it. And so I think this conversations like these will start to hopefully spark more connections within these communities.
Yeah, I think my experiences have been the same as Ashley and Zaid's. We in the Southeast, both Melungeons and Native communities in Virginia, North Carolina. This term is actually just used in the chat, right? Underwent sort of paper genocide right after the Civil War, right? Like Walter Plecker, who was the first chief of Virginia's Bureau of Vital Statistics, was very much hell-bent on sort of reclassifying all of the Native peoples in all three states as non-native, right, as a way to sort of write them off of records. Both, he employed a lot of eugenicist theories, right? This assumption that to be mixed race was to no longer be native, right? And I do think that a lot of the damage done throughout the 20th century is sort of being reversed now. That people are fighting to be recognized as Native communities, or that there are people who an unknown number of people who have been disconnected from the tribal communities that are finding their way back, right? I do think that the nature of sort of genealogy, the sort of growth of that has actually led to people, right? We've had several participants who sort of discovered their Native ancestry later in life, although we should be wary about, DNA tests as yielding a kind of truth of who one is, right? Sort of we don't want to quantify ourselves as percentages of this, percentages of that, but at least one of our participants, took a DNA test, which connected him to relatives that then sort of, he learned that he was, Native. And now actually, this is one of our participants who now works in his tribal government, who, reconnected, I think, with his community. He was in his 30s or 40s or maybe even 50s. So, I think that this is something that is sort of ongoing, and, and like I touched upon earlier, there is no sort of community organizations purely for Native Muslims or Muslims of Native ancestry. And yeah, but I do think that there is sort of, movement, both in terms of social movement, but also, a general flow of effort being made to kind of change this. And, well, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Mhm. Yeah, and we hope that this project, contributes to those efforts taking place right now. I think we have time for just a couple more questions. Can the panelists discuss the similarities in their nation's various theologies and cultural practices with Islam?
Yeah, I can jump in. I think something I mentioned with Brennan during the interviews was the practice of Ramadan and fasting and its similarities to peyote ceremonies. Because in a peyote ceremony, you're kind of, in the teepee from, I'm forgetting the exact time blocks, but essentially from dusk till dawn, and you're essentially going through a fast, and it's very similar to the fast of that a Muslim person, a practicing Muslim person, would participate in during Ramadan, and like foregoing food and water and things like that for a certain amount of time. So I think that was something that came up for me. Trying to think of others, but yeah, I think generally not necessarily a practice, but an understanding that this is also something that Brennan mentioned earlier, but an understanding and a reverence for the natural world, and seeing essentially as a Muslim person, you see God in the things around you and in nature. And I think that's another similarity that a lot of Native tribes share, is having a deep reverence for the natural world and knowing not to take too much, or to venture, not to go to certain places because you want to keep space for that. So those were a few things that came up for me during the interviews.
Yeah, I actually feel that personally, the intergenerational communities in which natives live, where multiple generations live together, is extremely similar to the way Muslims across, different countries live, which is also within a generational household. And I also find that being stewards of the land, when I feel you hear about Palestine and you hear about settlers that are destroying olive trees that were over 4,000 years old, is also a connection to their ancestors and how they live to steward the land in Palestine. I feel like it's very similar in the ways that, at least here in Chicago, at the First Nations Garden, we are stewards of the land, and we took a plot of land that was an old newspaper factory with terrible soil and created a garden that is what I consider a lush oasis in an urban environment, and took something from nothing and literally made it grow. And we also have just a reverence for, I would say, things like water. We also sing songs that say water is life. And I think that's also very similar in Islam, where we are told like not to waste water even while making wudu. Getting up in the morning praying Fajr is also very like similar, where different tribes get up to pray in the morning, also kind of very similar to Fajr. And just, I think, like the reverence for family is also like very important in both like Muslim cultures and Native cultures, in my opinion. So I just think there's also a lot of like similarities in terms of just our struggles, like in terms of land loss, where we're told like whoever takes land would suffer like a great consequence. So you see the land loss in Palestine, then you see the land loss in North America and Turtle Island. So I feel like there's a lot of similarities in our struggles and our cultural practices as well. So thank you.
Yeah, I think Zaid and Ashley have touched on a lot of, you know, the kind of similarities between native cultures and Islam, and particularly how they kind of operate on like this sort of broader kind of shared understanding of like pan-Indigenous activism and so forth. I think a lot of the kind of the more insular forms of you know, native knowledge in the Southeast is sort of kept kind of intra-community, you know, that it's stuff that, you know, one sort of needs permission to share kind of, you know, overall. But I will say that, you know, there are a lot of the general kinds of, you know, things that Ashley and Zaid shared are true in my experience as well. You know, I actually kind of came across or was put in contact with somebody writing a children's book from Melungeons that sort of talked about, you know, following a lunar calendar in the same way that the Hijri calendar is used, right? And, you know, different names for the different moons and so forth. And you know, there were a lot of interesting, you know, a lot of the kinds of, you know, 18th or 19th, 20th century sources on Melungeons in the Southeast, you know, talk about, you know, a sort of shared phenotype. You know, there were, you know, discussions of women covering their hair. You know, observers marked like, oh, you know, these people would stop 3 times a day and face east and, you know, prostrate and pray and so forth, right? These kinds of archaic associations that are there as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think that kind of ties into the last question I'll pose, just in the interest of time, but this has been such a rich discussion. Assalamu alaikum. Do you think your Islam supports Indigenous decolonization projects like Land Back? I think you guys sort of touched on this, but if anyone has anything sort of to add about that specific project, please do.
Well, I guess I can kind of explain my activism through the First Nations Garden, which was just a plot of land that explained before about how it was really just how a group of people made something out of literally nothing. We didn't have any type of ownership over the land, and now, as of this year, we will continue to have ownership from the city of Chicago for 99 years. So we are celebrating that accomplishment. So that is relatable to Land Back. Thank you.
Thank you, and congratulations, Ashley, on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, seriously. I think something else in general, I think Islam teaches you to fight oppression and up until the point that oppression stops and no further. And I think part of that for Indigenous communities in general who've seen their traditional lands taken from them, I think that goes directly in support of fighting to reclaim that land. And I think the Land Back movement and other decolonization projects follow along that same train of thought as Islam teaches. So generally, I think yes.
Yeah, I would just say, yeah, for sure. That this is one of the kind of core components for me. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. There's lots of people to thank. I'd like to thank Brennan for sharing the research and also participating, through sharing his own personal experience as a panelist. Thank you so much to Zaid and Ashley for participating in the project itself, and for contributing so much to this research, and also for joining us today to share your personal experiences. We're very grateful to you. Thank you so much to our audience members who joined the webinar today. I saw lots going on in the chat. I didn't get to read through it all, but thank you so much for the engagement and all the questions. I think it brought about a really fruitful discussion. And there's lots to build on and lots of future things for us to note down. Your feedback is important to us, sort of on that note. So please take a few minutes to fill out the poll that just popped up on your screen. This just allows us to improve our programming. Finally, a link to the research has been shared in the chat, and will also be emailed as a follow-up to this webinar. And we just ask that you please continue to be ambassadors for facts and share ISPU researches, specific to this work. And please do take a look at our other work, and please do share those with your network. And as I mentioned, a follow-up email will be sent out next week with a recording and resources relevant to this topic. So please, look out for that, and be prepared to share it with your network. And so that concludes our webinar today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And thank you, Brennan and Ashley, for sharing your perspectives and experiences.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. It's always so good to see ISPU folks, and also especially Zaid and Ashley today.
Yakoke and Jazakallah khair for having me.